So let me talk a little bit about Tisha B'Av. I'm just going to jump in right now. Let me talk a little bit about Tisha B'Av generally, and then I'll tell you what we're going to do tonight. So Tisha B'Av is about. It starts tonight and it goes until tomorrow night. And Tisha B'Av just means the ninth of the month of Av. And it is a fast day, and I for Tisha. I was talking to somebody else about this today. Tisha B'Av has always been very, very challenging for me, and I'll talk a little bit later about why I find it kind of theologically challenging. Um, I'm not sure if that's the right word, but I find it difficult in substance, but also just physically, I find it very difficult because it's a fast day in the middle of the summer. You're kind of in summer mode. At least I am in summer mode, meaning, I'm thinking about vacations, and work slows down a little bit, and it's just so intense and demanding. And also the days are very long and it's hard to fast. But anyway, very simply, Tisha B'Av commemorates the destruction of the temple. Which temple, whether the first or second temple it's commemorating, is actually an interesting question. But we read Eichah, we read the book of Lamentations, which just talks about the destruction of the first temple in 586 BCE. But Tisha B'Av is now seen to commemorate a whole host of different days of different elements of Jewish suffering throughout history, and that's something that we will talk about a little bit. Um, so the evening liturgy, the way that we do Tisha B'Av in the evening is we have a.
Did you offer a drugger?
What? One of you very awesome people has your mic on. If you could mute, that would be great. We usually there's a teaching of some kind, but the core of the liturgy is the reading of Eichah, of the book of Lamentations. We are not going to chant all of Eichah tonight, but we're going to chant a little bit from each of the 5 chapters of Eichah. And then tomorrow morning, the service is. Oh gosh, how long was I muted? Okay, good. All right. So tomorrow morning, the Tisha B'Av service is actually quite elaborate. Even though it's a weekday service, there's a Torah reading and a Haftarah reading and readings from the book of Eichah. So it's a beautiful, powerful service, but it's intense. The other thing I meant to say about tonight's service is that it's very common for people to be reading or chanting kinot, which are usually medieval poems of mourning and lamentation and pleading with God. We've not prepared kinot for chanting for tonight, but that's usually done. Let me talk a little bit about the prohibitions of Tisha B'Av. We don't eat or drink on Tisha B'Av. We don't wear leather shoes. So it's a lot like Yom Kippur. We don't have sexual relations, bathing, what's the word I'm looking for? Makeup, or, deodorant, or what's the word I'm thinking of? You know what I'm saying. We don't put stuff on our body. And we don't actually study Jewish religious texts unless they're related to the day of Eichah, or related to the day of Tisha B'Av, or related to Lamentations, or maybe to Jeremiah. But in general, those are the limitations we have. And then also there's a tradition of sitting low on the floor. A little awkward to do that. Maybe some of you might be doing that, but it's a little strange when we're not all together. But there's usually very powerful, somber environments that reflects this kind of inner state of mourning and sadness and remembrance and commemoration that we're trying to connect to. So that's Tisha B'Av in general, and the fast ends tomorrow evening, tomorrow at sundown, and it just begins this evening. So let me, I want to put my cards on the table here. Both my theological cards and my pedagogical cards on the table. So I really, the questions of Tisha B'Av that are coming up for me this year are still a little scrambled and disordered in my mind. In other words, I have not come up with a coherent answer to some of the problems and challenges that I see in Tisha B'Av. And so what I really have are several different reflections and texts that touch upon themes that are on my mind. But I don't have a sort of like coherent single message to convey, but rather a series of reflections. Let's see, I got two chats that are coming in here. Oh, Natan said, oh, thank you, Natan. Natan corrected my language. The fast ends tomorrow at nightfall. Not at sundown, right? So of course that's later. And if you don't have an app on your phone that has the Zmanim, you can find that by going to, or you can go to a website that has the Zmanim. So I think it's probably 9-ish, 9:30-ish or something like that when the fast ends. But okay, so with that in mind, let me now put my theological cards on the table, and then I'll share some text with you. Theologically, and again, I'm not sure that's quite the right word, because I don't mean theology in the narrow sense of, why does God exist? Why does God act in this way or that way? But rather really the whole relationship of Torah to the past. I really struggle with it, and honestly, I'm in a period in my own life as a Jewish learner and as a Jew, a little bit in a period of flux and transition. I don't know if transition is the right word, but a little bit of turbulence in a good way in my relationship to some of these questions about how the Jewish tradition absorbs the past and reflects its relationship to the present. For those of you whose lives are so sad and empty that you've been following my Facebook feed and my dialogue with the, I posted something about orthodoxy in the contemporary world, and for those of you who were tuned into that or commented on that thread, you know that I've got a lot of these questions on my mind. In particular, what does Judaism say about this moment? Not just the political moment, but how does Judaism relate to the modern world? And how do we let the modern world affect our thinking as Jews? Is on one side of the one set of questions, versus what is our obligation to sort of try to hold Judaism and hold Torah and keep it distant from modern ideas and issues that are in the contemporary world, so that we have a position from which to critique the culture. So I'll explain a little bit more about what I mean as we go through here. But the point is that I am in a period of flux and transition in my own thinking about some of these larger issues. So let me tell you what we're going to do, and then let me explain why I think it matters. Because I'm laughing, because if you have to explain why your shiur matters, you should probably spend another month preparing it. But this is, just bear with me. So I want to talk about how much freedom do we have to interpret and reinterpret Jewish texts and their meaning. And the reason I'm somewhat self-conscious about that is it seems like a little bit of a nerdy, text-centered, academic, no offense, Natan Meir, approach to a holiday, to a holy day that is all about the heart, and also particularly overly text-focused at a moment in our nation's life when there's so much going on around us that it seems odd to turn into the text and argue about hermeneutics, that is, argue about textual interpretation. But the reason that I want to do this is I hope to illustrate throughout my teaching and our discussion is because I believe that how we think about Tisha B'Av, how we think about the book of Lamentations, and how we think about the temple frames how we think about ourselves as Jews and our future. You could also say it the other way, and I guess it would have a slightly different valence, which is that how we think about ourselves as Jews and how we think about our sense of our obligation to the future will frame how we think about Tisha B'Av and the Book of Lamentations and issues of the temple. So that's why I'm allowing myself to indulge in my weakness for thinking about hermeneutics and the dynamics of textual interpretation, because I do think this is tied to core issues of what it means to be a Jew at an extraordinarily important moment for the Jewish people and for us as Jews in the modern world. I think how we answer these questions is so important. One more note about this Facebook thread that I introduced. In this Facebook thread, this seems off topic, but I hope to connect it. In this Facebook thread, I said that in my experience, the legacy of Rav Soloveitchik, are people familiar with that name, Rav Soloveitchik? Right? Some of you are, some of you have no clue who that is. Soloveitchik, for want of to simplify it, was one of the kind of great theological Jewish giants of the 20th century. And he is often associated, really, he's the name associated with Orthodoxy and modern Orthodoxy in particular in the 20th century. Totally brilliant man and a giant. All of us on this call many of us would have many things to disagree with Soloveitchik about, but few could deny his brilliance. And one of the things that made him the giant that he was, in my opinion, and made him so courageous and made him so powerful, was that he did not shy away from engaging some of the most difficult problems that were presented by modernity. That is the challenge of history, the challenge, philosophical challenges of existentialism, and the challenges that secular thinking posed to traditional and revealed religion. He never waffled in his faith and his commitment, but he wasn't afraid of those books and their authors. And so Soloveitchik was extraordinarily well-versed in the Western philosophical tradition and the Western historical tradition. And he spoke and wrote about some of the philosophical challenges to Judaism and how he addressed them. And what I said in this Facebook post, that I feel like the part of his legacy that has been embraced and carried on is his tremendous pride in being an Orthodox Jew, and his assertion that you could still be an Orthodox Jew, very much so in the modern world, and the modern world needed orthodoxy. But I argued that the part of his legacy that has not been embraced is his fluency and comfort with some of the challenges posed by the Western philosophical and historical tradition, and that I said I would like to hear more Orthodox rabbis talking more often about some of these very real philosophical challenges. So you can imagine how that went over. And I didn't make myself very clear, and I was slightly obnoxious in some of my tone, but my core challenge stands. And I'm saying all of this because what I think I didn't say well in that, but what I'm saying to you is that I think that these questions matter, and the reason that they're important to me, and the reason that I posted them and tried to engage my fellow Yidden on this question, is because I have a very, very deep and personal yearning to have these questions and challenges addressed. I believe that they matter. So this is not some polemic against Orthodoxy. It is, I have a very deep desire, as I believe all of us do, whether we're conscious of it or not, to have some of our deepest questions about how we take the past to address the Jewish present and the Jewish future. I think that these are not philosophical. These are questions in our hearts that we want to address. So that's the framing concern. And with all of that, I'm going to jump in and share some, we're going to read some text together, okay? All right. So the first thing that I want to say before we go to our first text is that the one aspect that I want to focus on, that of what's fascinating about Tisha B'Av, what's fascinating about the Book of Lamentations that I think presents us with a problem and a challenge and an opportunity, is the sort of eternality or the timelessness of the Book of Lamentations. And I mean something very specific by that. The Book of Lamentations was written in the wake of the destruction of the first temple in 586 BCE. And the tradition ascribes it to Jeremiah. We can talk about that at another time, the authorship of the book. But Eichah, even though it was written for in a particular moment, in response to a particular crisis, after a couple of centuries, it became the sort of text that transcended history. And so I'll give you an example of that in our first text here. Bum, ba-dum, bum, bum. Okay, you see a text in front of you? Nods, thumbs up, something? Yes? Okay, thank you. Keep in mind that I don't know what you're seeing, so if I ask you to respond, it's because I just need to know that the technology is working. Okay, so this is from Mishnah Ta'anit. So Mishnah Ta'anit, the Mishnah, I don't know, it probably is knowable. I don't know exactly when this Mishnah would have been composed, but in general, the dates of the Mishnah are 200 BCE to 200 CE, somewhere over this 400-year period, very roughly, is when the Mishnah was composed and this oral discourse emerged and it was eventually written down. But the point is that it's a long time after the Book of Lamentations is written. And so Mishnah Ta'anit says this. Miles, will you read this just because I happen to be looking at you? You can read it in English if you would. Oops, we can't hear you, my friend. You're muted.
There were 5 events that happened to our ancestors on the 9th of Av. It was decreed that our ancestors should not enter the land. The temple was destroyed the first and the second time. Beitar was captured, and the city was plowed up. When Av enters, they limit their rejoicing.
Okay, so here we have this thread of connection to the destruction of the temple, which I'll explain in a moment, and then it is expanded well beyond the confines of the destruction of the temple to be associated with other historical moments. By the way, in calling on Miles, I continue my weird and totally unplanned habit of calling on the few people who can actually read Hebrew to read text in English. But anyway, so okay, so the Tisha B'Av, what it commemorates, and I guess I should have begun with this, is the destruction of the temple on the 9th of Av. That's the date that our tradition is associated with it. But here you see that it was decreed that our ancestors should not enter the land on the 9th of Av, right? So what text is it talking about when it says the ancestors should not enter the land, that was decreed? Where is that from? I'm not asking for a year, but where do we hear about that? In the Torah, right?
Devarim.
Yeah, what's that?
The spies.
Yeah, that's right. What did you say, Miles?
Devarim?
Well, it's actually earlier than that, but it's repeated in Devarim. But yeah, it's in response to the story of the spies. So obviously that's well before all of this. It's well before the destruction of the temple. It's well before the book of Eichah. The temple was destroyed the first and the second time. Okay, so it's not just that it was destroyed on the 9th of Av in the 586 BCE. it also was destroyed in the year 70 on the 9th of Av. Betar was captured, so now it sort of shifts to kind of political struggles, and the city was plowed up. And then when Av enters, they limit their rejoicing. I actually didn't mean to include this, but that's a separate topic, but I'm sure you're familiar with that. In the month of Av, we sort of diminish our celebrations. Okay, so I'm using this just to shed light on this idea that that the rabbis, already in the time of the rabbis, the destruction of the first temple was didn't just stand for the destruction of the first temple alone. It already had this kind of broader significance that reached across history. Okay, and I'm going to go somewhere with that idea, so that's why I'm belaboring. That's why I'm belaboring this. Hold on, let's go into full screen mode here. Oh, much better. Okay. So, so that's a text from Mishnah Ta'anit. There are many others I could have used, but this is the one that I settled upon. So now what we're going to look at is, now there is, if we look at, let me get Eichah up here. Whoops, sorry, I thought I had it for us. One moment. My apologies. Okay, so here we're going to look at a text that is a midrash on the book of Lamentations itself, and it's starting with 5:5. So now we're looking at the book of Eichah itself. So why doesn't somebody just read the first 5 verses? Trevor, can you unmute yourself and just read these first 5 verses in English?
Remember, O Lord, what has befallen us. Behold and see our disgrace. Our heritage has passed to aliens, our homes to strangers. We have become orphans, fatherless. Our mothers are like widows. We must pay to drink our own water, obtain our own kindling at a price. We are hotly pursued, exhausted. We are given no rest.
Okay. Whoa, 1 second. Oh, I see there's a bad citation here. Oh no, there it is. Where they say in verse 5, they translate it as "we are hotly pursued," but that's an idiomatic translation. Literally, it says like we're pursued upon our necks, or they're breathing down our necks, you might say. So that's the verse that the midrash is going to explore. So the midrash is generally called Eichah Rabbah or Eichah Rabbati, and it is a reflection on the book of Lamentations that is separated by several hundred years from the events of the destruction itself and from the composition of the book of Lamentations itself. So it has a different perspective on the meaning of the book of Lamentations because it is separated from it by a couple of hundred years of history, by a few hundred years of history. Okay, so why doesn't somebody read this very intense and graphic text? David Stern, can I get you, actually Ann Prawl, I realize I'm leaning heavily male here. Ann Prawl, will you read some English here?
You bet. Our pursuers are at our necks. Hadrian, may his bones be crushed, decreed and said, if we come and find a Jew with hair, we will take off his head. That's what is written. Our pursuers are at our necks.
Okay. So sorry, pause there. I do want to say I find particularly delight in making people who are very smiley and friendly with lovely voices read verses like "May his bones be crushed." But what I want to point out here is that it begins by talking about Hadrian. Okay, so in interpreting the verse from the book of Lamentations, okay, which is written which is written following the destruction of the first temple in 586 BCE, the Midrash says what this refers to is the persecution of Hadrian, who lived 600 years after this event. Okay, so without a problem, without explanation, without apology, the rabbis take Lamentations and they bring it out, they rip it out of its temporal context and they put it into a different context. Okay, let's keep going and pick up it alternatively. So when it says alternatively, what it means is now we're going to give you a different way to understand that same verse.
Alternatively, our pursuers are at our necks, for we rebelled against our necks on this day of distress and had thrown off the yoke of Torah. We have toiled and have received no rest. Nebuchadnezzar, may his bones be crushed, commanded Nebuzaradan and said to him, the God of these people accepts repentant ones, and his hand extends to receive those who return to him.
So let's just pause. Let's pause there. For the purposes of brevity, I'm not going to unpack this midrash. I simply want to just show you at a very, very high level that without missing a beat, here the midrash suggests that this ancient text refers to Hadrian, and here in the next line it says, or it could refer to Nebuchadnezzar II, who lived during the time of the first of the destruction of the first temple. So again, my point is simply this easy, seamless shifting, jumping around in time, and the sense that the book of Lamentations does not only refer to the particular destruction that inspired its composition. Okay, so that's already in our history. So now I'm now interested in, immediately interested in, okay, well, what are the limits? What are the limits then? If it can apply, if our tradition says it can apply to the throughout these early centuries of leaders who oppressed the Jewish people, is there a limit to that? Is there a temporal limit? Like once you get past the year, well, let's see, once you get past Hadrian, can you no longer do that? Like, is there a limit, like at 500 of the Common Era, you have to stop, or once you get past the medieval period? Like, are we entitled to continue to interpret the book of Lamentations in light of our own events? And if we are we doing anything different than our predecessors were doing, right? So if we jump into this and we interpret it and we say, I see the contemporary world in light of what I'm seeing in the book of Lamentations, and I'm interpreting it in that way, are we doing something fundamentally different, or are we just simply continuing the tradition that our rabbis gave us and we have carte blanche to kind of interpret it as we want? Okay, so that's one general theme I want to get out there and sort of file that away. Okay, so now another thing another variable here, another pressing theme of the tradition, if not the central theme, is the suffering of Jewish people, and the suffering of the Jewish people, I should say. Okay, so now let's read this unlovely story from Eichah Rabbah, from the midrash that interprets the book of Lamentations. So David Stern, will you read here in English? A Jew passed in front.
A Jew passed in front of Hadrian and greeted him. The king asked, "Who are you?" He answered, "I am a Jew." He exclaimed, "Dare a Jew pass in front of Hadrian and greet him?" He ordered, "Take him and cut off his head." Another Jew passed, and seeing what
had happened
to the first man, did not greet him. The king asked, "Who are you?" He answered, "A Jew." He exclaimed, "Dare a Jew pass in front of Hadrian without giving greeting?" He ordered, "Take him and cut off his head." His senators said to him, "We cannot understand your actions. He who greeted you was killed, and he who did not greet you was killed." He replied to them, "Do you seek to advise me how I wish to kill those I hate?"
So there's probably more that we could do with this text, but for right now, I just want this to sort of be a stand-in for the many, many texts, voluminous texts that are focused on what we would now call anti-Semitism, which was not a word that's a distinctively modern word, but hatred and oppression of the Jewish people. So this is totally central to the book of Lamentation. But this is not the only way to read the book of Lamentation. So I want to be kind of deliberate here because I think that this is very, very important. The book of Lamentations and Tisha B'Av have become associated with Jewish suffering. And so, when we looked at that Mishnah, we talked about a few different examples of like terrible national tragedies that the 9th of Av was associated with. But the litany of horrible events in Jewish history associated with the 9th of Av continues well into the medieval and even the modern period. People have talked about the expulsion from Spain being connected with the 9th of Av, and people have associated the outbreak, I think, of World War I being somewhere around that period. I can't speak to the veracity of these claims. I'm just saying that these moments are this date. And this holy day is seen as a day that is connected to terrible Jewish suffering, and therefore it's a day that becomes associated with anti-Semitism, and that therefore the question arises: if we're asking the question, are there limits to how much we can rip the book of Lamentations from its temporal context? That is, does it have to only speak to 586 BCE, or can we also have it speak to the year 2020? The question is, must we, when we focus on the book of Lamentations, must we focus on Jewish suffering? Okay, so must the modern discourse around Lamentations be about discussions of anti-Semitism? I'm not asking that rhetorically. I mean, this is a real question for me. Now, and when I say must, I hope people understand, I'm not saying like there's some secret law we're violating. I'm saying to be authentic to the texts and to stand within the Jewish tradition and to claim that you're doing justice to the Jewish tradition in how it should be, quote unquote, appropriately exercised or engaged with, must we use Jewish suffering as the theme. Now, let me tell you why, though it may seem obvious that Tisha B'Av must be a moment in which we focus on particularly Jewish suffering, and it almost seems difficult to make an argument that it shouldn't be, as the medieval keynote, the poems that traditionally are read in Tisha B'Av focus on Jewish suffering. We commemorate the brutality of Jewish life in the medieval period and their suffering at the hands of Christians and other oppressors. However, the book of Lamentations itself, when you read the book of Lamentations, well, let me ask you, when you read the book of Lamentations, do you read it and walk away from it saying, oh, the reason that the temple was destroyed is because people hated the Jewish people? What is the argument, if any, that the book of Lamentations makes about why this terrible stuff befell the Jewish people? Don't overthink it, because it's right in the text if you can remember it. Well, 3, 2, 1. So what is generally what the book of Lamentations focuses on, it does indeed talk about the cruelty of the oppressor, but it's really, the book of Lamentations suggests that the oppressor is really the instrument of God's will. So the oppressor is just doing what God wanted the oppressor to do. And that's also comes out in the Midrash. But more to the point, the oppressor is maybe, their cruelty is in being overly gleeful at how bad things have gotten for the Jewish people. But the book of Lamentations, its core message is, we have sinned. We have sinned. And that is why this has befallen us. We have walked away from God, and that's why this has befallen us. So that's a message that would explain the destruction of the temple, not by looking at anti-Semitism or Jew hatred or the oppression of Jews and their suffering, but rather their kind of self-inflicted spiritual wounds and an extension of the prophetic message that we find throughout all of the prophets, in which the prophets say that if the Jewish people walk away from God, God will be distanced and that will no longer be able to protect the Jewish people. So given that that seems to be a theme that it is at the core, not only of Lamentations, but also in the early Midrashim about Lamentations, and that it's not focused on Jewish suffering, must we continue to use Tisha B'Av as a day to talk about Jewish suffering and anti-Semitism? Again, that's a real question and not a rhetorical question. Okay, so now let me give you let me pause and see if there are questions or comments thus far before we shift gears a tiny bit. I don't believe it. Somebody make up a question. How do I turn my mic on? Okay, if there really are no questions, I'll move on. But if you got a question, raise your hand.
Got a comment.
Okay, do it.
Based on what you just said, I think perhaps the idea is not so much to look at anti-Semitism, but introspection. What did we do wrong? How did we sin? How can we be better? How
Great.
can we get closer to God?
Great. Okay, nice. Okay, so that's precisely, I think it's a beautiful point and a powerful one. So now let's look at a text that, we'll look at two texts that maybe pick up on that theme a little bit, okay? So one of them, this is also from Midrash Eichah Rabbah. So I said that both the Midrash and the Book of Lamentations itself lay the blame for the destruction at the feet of the Jewish people. And so just to drill down a little bit, one of the many explanations, and this is not the only theme or even the main theme of the Midrash, but one of the themes of the Midrash has to do with questions of justice. So let's see, who else, will somebody jump in and read this in English? Somebody whose face I can't see because you're covered up. Abby Layton, you want to read that? You're muted.
Hey, Rabbi, I'm not feeling very well.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, sorry to put you on the spot. Okay, I will read it. I hope you feel better, Abby. Judah has gone into exile because of misery and harsh oppression. This is a quote from, I think, the third verse of the first chapter of the Book of Lamentations. Sorry, I didn't cite it. So now the Midrash wants to explore, what does this verse mean? The reason, says the Midrash, they've gone into exile because of misery and harsh oppression, because they seized the pledges made for loans of the poor from their houses, though that is contrary to the verse, which is in Deuteronomy, which says, when you make a loan of any sort to your countryman, you may not enter his house to seize his pledge. In other words, just to put it simply, in other words, they violated the Torah. The Torah has these protections for the poor and the vulnerable, and according to the Midrash, the people at that time ignored the book of Deuteronomy and its commandment to make sure that it's fair to those who are in straits. A different interpretation, because that meaning the Jewish people, dealt harshly regarding the wages of hired workers, as it is written in Deuteronomy, you must not deal harshly with a hired worker who is poor and needy. Okay, so the Midrash is claiming that the way to understand this verse is that the misery and the harsh oppression is misery and harsh oppression that took place among the people. Jews were not treating each other justly and were not creating a just society. Now, for sure, the emphasis on the Midrashist, when they read this, is they're imagining the Jewish society was not functioning properly. Jews were not treating other Jews well. So I didn't put the Deuteronomy Hebrew quote in here, but when it says make a loan of any sort to your countrymen, what countrymen mean is a fellow Israelite. Okay, but this introduces this question of, for want of a better term, of justice. Okay, so one of the reasons, according to the Midrash, one of the reasons Jerusalem fell and the Jewish people were punished was because the poor and the vulnerable were being marginalized and hurt, and the Jewish people were ignoring their obligations to create a holy and just society. So is it legitimate for people, for example, there's an observance downtown tonight of Tisha B'Av, the rabbis are downtown, and commemorating Tisha B'Av in the context of Black Lives Matter. Well, you could make the argument that it's not that big of a leap from this kind of interpretation that the Midrash does to that sort of easy association with Tisha B'Av, not just with Jewish suffering and not just with Jewish injustice, but with injustice more broadly. So is that now a legitimate step for us to take? So that's.
So may I ask a question?
Yes, sir.
So, I mean, it seems to me that my sort of simple understanding of Jewish history is that we begin in a fairly universal position in the sense that we can't really imagine a society outside of ours. It's all about our society, and so there's a universalism to it. But as we proceed through exile into Europe, into Ashkenaz, we become increasingly parochial, and
Right.
and our willingness to to differentiate between justice for us and justice for others grows and grows and expands until
Right.
arguably we reach the 19th century when it's perhaps
Right.
at a peak. And
Right.
then there's modernity happens, and some Jews break away and begin to universalize. But authenticity, from a sort of traditional rabbinic perspective, leads in a less and less universalizing direction, in my understanding.
Right. Right. You're saying that. So you're saying authenticity, that is remaining true to the Jewish tradition, which is a concept we'd have to unpack, is in tension or in conflict with, or at least the way the rabbis understood it, is in conflict with the kind of more universal impulse to read this verse as being like, okay, this applies to Black Lives Matters.
Right, and we have to be willing to go back to sort of at least a midrash Eichah level, or possibly to the biblical strata, to claim the universalism.
Right.
But if we venture into modernity of the Shulchan Aruch and
Right.
further, which is often the claim that authenticity lies in the 16th, 17th centuries,
Right.
then we have to be willing to break with that form of authenticity and go for a more biblical or early Talmudic authenticity.
Right. So I think that's such a great comment. And I have a lot of thoughts about it, but I saw a couple of other hands up. So I'm going to try to not forget what you said. And I want to, David Stern and maybe Joel, did I see your hand? David Stern, go ahead.
I think Eichah is avoiding or answering the difficult question of theodicy by saying nothing happens unless God approves it. And
Right.
you're talking about a situation today, let's say Black Lives Matter, any kind of democratic, anti-democratic move operates under the assumption that people are the authors of their action. If you want to talk about, then there is a similarity that if there's structural problems, like there were structural problems when the temple was destroyed, and the second temple, when there was a conflict between the zealots and the less zealot Jews.
Right. Right.
But people today don't seek to go through God. They seek to go through what they believe is right. And now you could say that there's a conformity between what's right and what's godly, but I don't think people today act under the assumption that they're trying to work through a divine intermediary.
Right. Yeah. That well said. Well said. But as you so kind of a couple of things in here resonate with your point, David. One is that the Midrash Rabbah is focusing here on, look, this is caused by our decisions, our choices. We did these things, or rather we failed to do these things. We failed, the Jewish people failed to create a just society, and therefore this other thing happened. And so there is an equation, as there always is in the Torah, between the ethical and the religious, right? There's no distinction. So violating the ethical necessarily has consequences in the political realm. And Paul.
Well, I think it can only go so far away from the original, because like you just said, we failed to do something, so bad things happened to us. And
Right.
that's what the Midrash is saying, and that's what Eichah is saying as well. But I don't know how far away from the Jewish people you can take that, because the obligations are for the Jewish people. So the Jewish people fail in their obligations, so bad things happen to Black people doesn't make it's harder to make that leap.
Right, correct. I see what you're saying. Yeah, no, that's very well said, and I think that's right. If you sort of do the algebra, so to speak, the kind of the ethical algebra, it doesn't work out. But if you say, look, the Torah was, and this is a much larger conversation, and I don't want to open up a can of worms here because we don't have the time for it. But if you say that, for example, the verse from Deuteronomy that's cited here, that in the context of the Torah, the time of the Torah, it was only talking about the obligations of Jews, of Israelites to other Israelites. But of course, we shouldn't, somebody might say, we shouldn't, as modern people living in a heterogeneous society, we as Jews should not feel like we only have real deep ethical obligations to other Jews. In the modern world, we should of course feel that we have obligations that are equal to all people, whether they're Jewish or not. And therefore, the argument would go, the failure to pay attention to the suffering of African Americans, or one might say of poor people or vulnerable people of any kind, has created a kind of destructiveness in our society that we can't hide from, and that would be the connection between the spiritual and the political. But you have to be willing, to buy that argument, you have to be willing to make the argument that we can universalize our very particular texts.
Well, yeah, I think I'm having trouble even beginning that argument, that we said, we will, what is it? We will do it, and we will hear it, and we will do it.
Right, we will do, and we will.
Yeah. So how can our failure to pay attention to the plight of other people be the cause of other people's distress?
I see what you're saying. Right.
We can't be held accountable for larger society because larger society hasn't agreed to follow these obligations.
Right, I hear you. Right, that's true if you read it in a strict sense, but I'm just saying, can you read this as if you universalize the book of Deuteronomy, this verse, can you say, look, the Jewish people back in the day, they just had an obligation to their own poor people, their own vulnerable people. But now God is saying, given that we now have the ability to reach beyond the Israelites and Jewish people, and we can affect the lives of other people, then of course we have the same moral and ethical obligation, and that therefore, that is to all people, and therefore when we see suffering of African Americans or whoever it might be in our society, we have an obligation to tend to that, lest our Jerusalem, quote unquote, that is where we live, be destroyed by the same kind of insensitivity that plagued us back then. But I'm not saying you have to buy the argument. I'm just saying that is an argument that one would make. I want to draw this to a close because we still have Ma'ariv ahead of us. But what I want to circle back to, and Mickey, there was a beautiful text that I was going to share that gets to your point about the destruction and the suffering being like an indication to us that we have to change our ways. I don't have time to share that text, but I'll email it to you. But I will just say that this is the core, I think the core message, whether one reads it as being a particularly Jewish, a day focused on lessons about Jewish suffering and Jewish behavior towards other Jews, or whether somebody universalizes it more. To me, it seems like what the core message is in both cases is the idea of teshuvah. The idea that that our own suffering or the suffering of other people, the Jewish response to suffering is self-understanding. Now, the dark side of that was, some people would say that we can get into sort of neurotic blame the victim. Like if something terrible happens to us, one might go down the road of what did I do to deserve this? Which is not a theology that I accept or embrace. But David Hartman has a beautiful take on this in his book, A Living Covenant. in which he says we don't buy that theologically because it's morally problematic, certainly in the wake of the Holocaust, but on an individual basis, there is value when confronted with suffering to asking the question, what is it that I can learn from this? Is there some way that this can transform me, or I can transform myself in response to this suffering? Ki'ilu, as if I were responding to it like a message from God. But either way, whether we take the particular or the universal, the idea is that this is the time when we focus deeply on teshuvah. We look at our broken world, and again, you can read that the Jewish world or the broader world, and I think we have to look at the broader world, and we say, why is it like this? How have the Jewish people failed to create goodness around us and blessing around us? How have I failed to contribute to that? And how do I commit to healing my small corner of the world, or in whatever way I can? And that's why the Tisha B'Av is not some randomly placed event that just happens to take place in the summer. We are now on the final approach to the high holidays, right? We're now at like 30,000 feet coming down, and Teshuvah is now front and center. And so the book of Eichah orients us towards connecting our own individual behavior and responsibility to the state of the world around us, and making that move from the inner, that is my own personal responsibility, my relationship to God, my relationship to other people, to the realm outside of me, the Jerusalem, whether you understand that narrowly or broadly. That connection is absolutely central to this day, and should inspire us to do a lot of self-examination, and that is teshuvah, which is indeed the final note in the book of Lamentations. And I will just close on this very incomplete conversation, but I'll just close by circling back to this tension that Miles surfaced between authenticity and universalism. I'm not sure that those two have to be opposed necessarily, but I do think that that is our challenge as well. I will say this, it is my challenge now as a Jew. This is very much on my mind, and in a funny way, this brings me full circle as a Jew in my own life to a set of questions that I had set aside in my younger years that I'm now very much preoccupied with, which is, how can a Jew in the 21st century live with a sense of existential responsibility to all beings, and certainly to fellow country people, to not say that my obligations are exhausted at the limits of the Jewish community, and to kind of have that universalist impulse while still remaining authentic to the Jewish tradition, both in how one reads Jewish texts, but also in how one contributes to one's Jewish community. How is it truly possible, and not just an ideal, to be like to be a Jew who is so deeply engaged with one's local Jewish community and with tzedakah, and making sure that Jews are taken care of, that because they're part of your family, and that you take seriously upholding Jewish institutions and their well-being, and you spend time focusing on that, and your own shul and your whatever other institutions they might be, making sure you have a fully functioning Jewish community, and contributing to its harmony and its growth, and the teaching of the next generation. Can you do that and still live a life in which you are also giving appropriate time and attention and commitment, financially and otherwise, to those other people in the world who are not Jewish, to whom you have moral and perhaps religious obligations as well? And I think that is, this is not a new challenge. This is a very old, modern challenge. But I think with everything that's happening in our country and in the world, I think that we have to circle back to these questions and get them right, because in a way, everything rests on this, both the Jewish future and the healing of our world. So having gone on a little bit longer and a little more discursively than I intended to, I will now draw it to a close, and thank you all for your attention and for your comments. And I'm going to turn it over now to our beautiful Chazan. And we are going to begin our Ma'ariv service. So what I want to do, let me ask you this. How many folks have a Siddur of their own in front of them or within arm's reach? Most people I can't see because they don't have their video on. Okay, so the Chazan is going to begin, and I'm going to, as we do that, I'm going to track down the online version of the Siddur on Sefaria because I can't see everybody, and I'm just going to have to assume that they do not have the Siddur.
Rabbi,
Yes, sir.
just to reiterate, we still don't do Baruch Hu and the Kadishim and all of that, right?
Okay, so that's right. And of course, at the Ma'ariv service, there's no repetition of the Amida. So I'll invite you to take off your shoes, by the way, if you've not done so, because we traditionally do this without wearing shoes, certainly not leather shoes. We will go to the Amidah. Let me find this, and then we will rise. Folks can rise. And I will share this with you in 1 sec. Whoops. Sorry, we don't rise. I was not using my noggin. Okay. We begin with the blessings of the Shema, but not the Baruch Hu.
ורחום מכפר ונגלו השיר וידבר השיבה פה ולא אל כל חמתו אדוני יושיע מלבנינו ביום קוראינו ברוך אתה אדוננו מלך העולם אשר בברו מראה ורבים ובחומה פותח שערים שהייתי מחליף לפעמים ומעביר יום ומביא לילה ומבדיר בין יום ובין לילה אדוני צבאות שמו אל חי וקיים תמיד ימלוך עלינו לעולם ועד ברוך אתה אדוני אמרי ורבי אהבת עולם ותשמר עמך ותורה מצוות חוקים משפטים כי הם חיינו ברוך ימינו והם נהגה יומם ולילה ואהבתך אל תסיר ממנו לעולמים ברוך אתה אדוני אוהב עמו ישראל שמע ישראל אדוני אלוהינו אדוני ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיכם אמת אמונה כל זו מקיים עלינו ומלכותו ברצון קיבלו להם משה ובני ישראל. לחנו שירה בשמחה רבה ואמרו כולם, מי כמוך באלים אדוני, מי כמוך נדר בקודש, נורא תהילות אסרף אלה. מלכותך ראו בניך בוקי הים לפני משה, זה הביאנו ואמרו, אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד. ונאמר כי פדדנו את יעקב, וגלו מיד חזק ממנו, ברוך אתה אדוני גל ישראל. השכיבנו אדוני אלוהינו לשלום, עמידנו מלכנו לחיים. ושמור צאתנו ובואנו לחיים ולשלום, מעתה ועד עולם. ברוך אתה אדוני שומר ישראל לעד. ברוך אדוני לעולם, אמן ואמן.
כי לא יתושם כל העם יבלו על בניהם וימרחו, אדוני הוא אלוהים, אדוני הוא אלוהים, כי גויים אשר עשית יבואו וישתחוו לפניך אדוני. רוח כל בשר איש וידך אף כי רוחי והגית אותי אליהם. וקיים מלכותך תמיד ימלוך לעולם ועד. כי יכולים לשמוע.
כי המלכות שלך היא ולמד תמלוך בכבוד, כי אין לנו מלך אלא אתה, ברוך אתה אדוני, המלך בכבודו תמיד ימלוך עלינו לעולם ועד, ועל כל מעשיו.
Okay, we rise now for the Amidah. You should face east from where you're standing, if you're able to. And the Amidah is here in the Hebrew. I'm sorry, I don't have a version with the transliteration. But if I find one, I will let you know. We rise. There you go. I'll let people take a moment to wrap up, and then we'll move to the book of Eichah. So we are going to chant from Eichah. As I said, we're not going to chant the whole Megillah. We're going to do the first chapter and the fifth chapter. And what I just want to say very, very briefly, some of you have probably heard me teach this more than once, but I always like to point it out because I think it's so profound and powerful. There's a couple of midrashim that point out that the word Eichah, which is translated here as alas, doesn't really have a meaning, a specific meaning. It's sort of like a cry, alas, or you might say. But Eichah has the same letters as the word Eichah, which is what God says after Adam kind of foils the initial divine plan. And God is looking for Adam and Eve. And so Eichah, where are you, is God's cry out to humanity when they have broken away from God. And so one might read this as not only Eichah, but also as Eichah, as God suffering because the Jewish people have disconnected themselves from God. Anyway, I'm going to ask the Chazan to read this. I'll scroll as he reads, and we'll do the first and the fifth chapters.
Eichah yashva badad ha'ir rabatia ma'ayita ke'almana rabati v'goyim sarati b'mdinot hayta lahamas b'choti v'keh בלילה ונמתה על לחייה אלא מנחם מכל אוהביה כל רעיה בגדו בה היו לה לאויבים גלתה יהודה מעוני ומרוב עבודה היא ישבה בגויים לא מצא מנוח, כל רודפיה השיגוה בין המצרים. דרכי ציון אבלות, מבלי באי מועד, כל שעריה שוממים, כהניה נאנחים, בתולותיה נוגות, וימר לה, היו צריה לראש אויביה שלו, כי אדוני הוגה על רוב פשעיה. עולליה הלכו שבי לפני צר, ויצא מבת ציון כל הדרה. היו שריה חיילים לא מצאו מרעה, וילכו ולא כוח לפני רודף. זכרה ירושלים ימי עוניה ומרודיה, כל מחמדיה אשר היו מימי קדם. בנפול עמה ביצר, ואין עוזר לה, ראו צרים, שחקו על משבטיה. חטא חטאה ירושלים, על כן לנידה הייתה. כל מחבליה יזלוה, כי ראו ערוותה, גם היא נאנחה, ותשבחו. טומאתה בשוליה, לא זכרה אחריתה, ותרד פלאים, אין מנחם לה. ראה אדוני את עוני, כי הגדיל אויב. ידו פרס הצר על כל מחמדיה. כי ראתה הגויים באו מקדשה, אשר ציוותה, לא יבואו בקהלך. כל המאנחים מבקשים לכם, נתנו מחמדיהם, באוכל להשיב נפש. ראה אדוני והביטה, כי הייתי זוללה. לו עליכם כל עוברי דרך, הביטו וראו, אם יש מכאוב כמכאובי, אשר עולה לי. אשר הוגה אדוני ביום חרון אפו. ממרום שלח אש בעצמותיי, וירדנה. פרץ רשת לרגלי, אשיבני אחור. נתנני שוממה כל היום דהבה. נשקד על בשעי בידו, הסתרגו, עלו על צווארי, הכשיל כוחי. נתנני אדוני בידי לא אוכל קום. סלה כל אבירי אדוני בקרבי, קרא עלי מועד לשבור בחורי. גד טרח אדוני לבתולת בת יהודה. על אלה אני בוכייה, איני יורד המים, כי רחק ממני מנחם משיב נפשי. היו בניי שוממים, כי גבר אויב. פרסת ציון בידיה, אין מנחם לה. ציווה אדוני ליעקב סביביו צרה. הייתה ירושלים לנידה ביניהם. צדיק הוא אדוני, כפיהו מרביתי. שמונה כל העמים, וראו מכאובי, בתולותי ובחורי, הלכו בשבי. קראתי למאהבי, המה רימוני, כהני וזקני, בעיר גבהו. כי ביקשו אוכל להמו, וישיבו את נפשם. ראה אדוני קיצר לי, מאיכה מרמרו. נהפך ליבי בקרבי, כי מרום מהריתי. מחוץ שקל אחר בבית קמה ושמעו כי ננך אני מנחם לי כל אויבי שמעו רעתי ששו כי אתה עשית את היום קראת ויוחמוני תבוא כל רעתם לפניך ועוללמו כאשר עוללת לי על כל פשעי כי רבות הנחותיי ולבי דווי. Rabbi, you have to unmute yourself, Rabbi.
Sorry. What I just said was so fascinating and insightful, so you missed it.
Okay.
So that I'll just say that I want to just draw out a theme that we talked about towards the very end of the shiur, which is encapsulated in this first chapter. So chapter 1 begins with Eichah yashva v'dad ha'ir bati am hayta k'almana. Lonely sits the city. He looks out and he sees the entire city like as a unified whole. And the city becomes personified, like all of these millions of people living together in total suffering and destruction. And he talks about Judah as a people, that is the Jewish people, going into exile. So he's standing as an individual looking at their suffering. And then look at the incredible power of the last verse, where the author turns it around totally, and now he's focusing on himself and his own suffering. So let all their wrongdoings come before you and deal with them as you have dealt with me. For all of my transgressions, for my sighs are many, v'libi davai, and my heart is sick. And so what I'm trying to draw out is that I think the core message, in some ways, I guess the core message of Tisha B'Av, and maybe you could say of Torah in general, is that ultimately one's individual personal experience on the truest level is inseparable from the experience of other human beings, because we are a whole, we are one. And so as he's describing their reality, he's also describing his own reality, and the structure of the first chapter reflects that. So I just wanted to draw that out. And we're going to leapfrog now to the 5th chapter, and then we'll close out the service. And the 5th chapter contains a passage, a verse that you will no doubt recognize and is incredibly powerful. Okay, chapter 5.
זכור אדוני מהיה לנו הביטה וראה את חרפתנו. נחלתנו נפחה לזרים, בתינו לנוכרים. יתומים היינו ואין אב אמותינו כאלמנות. מימינו בכסף שתינו, אצלנו במחיר יבוא. על צווארנו נרדפנו, יגענו ולא נחלנו. מצרים נתנו יד אשור, לסבוע לכם. אבותינו חטאו ואינם, ואנחנו עוונותיהם סבלנו. עבדים משלו בנו פורעט, אין מידם. בנפשנו נביא לחמנו, מפני חרב המדבר. אורינו כתנור נחמרו, מפני זלעפות רעב. נשים בציוננו בתולות בערי יהודה. שרים בידם נתלו, פני זקנים לא נהדרו. בחורים תחון נשאו, ונערים בעץ כשלו. זקנים משער שבתו, בחורים מנגינתם. שבת משוש ליבנו, מהפך לעבר מחולנו. נפלה עטרת ראשנו, אוי נא לנו כי חטאנו. על זה היה דווה ליבנו, על אלה חשקו עינינו. על הר ציון ששמם, שואלים הלכו בו. אתה אדוני לעולם תשב, כיסך לדור ודור. למה לנצח תשכחנו, תעזבנו לאורך ימים. השיבנו אדוני אליך ונשובה, חדש ימינו כקדם. כי אם מאסתנו, קצפת עלינו ברמאו. השיבנו אדוני אליך ונשובה, חדש ימינו
Thank you. There's a beautiful teaching from the Kedushat Levi, which I do not have time to teach tonight, which I must share with the community somehow because it's so powerful. On this last verse, I'll share it with you another time, maybe tomorrow morning. Take us back, God, to you, restore us to you, and we will return, renew our days as of old. Amen. Okay, we're going to continue now with the I can get it up here. All right. Let's rise for Aleinu.
עלינו לשבח לאדון הכל, לתת גדולה ליוצר בראשית, שלא עשנו כגויי הארצות, ולא שמנו כמשפחות האדמה, שלא שם חלקנו כהם, וגור עלינו ככל המונם. ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים, הקדוש ברוך הוא שמיים. על כן נקרא לך. כל ישראל יכירו ידעו כל ישראל תגלה. ותאור מלכותך תמכם על הבית, כי המלכות שלך. ככתוב בתורתך אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד, ונאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ. ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד, ושמו
Thank you to the Chazan for leading. Thank you to all of you for being here. We're going to go to the Kaddish now. If you'd like to share the name of the person for whom you're saying Kaddish, please do so now.
What's the matter?
Okay, I know Joel's remembering his father. I'm remembering my father, Harav Emmanuel ben Harav Avraham Yosef Bamalka, Rabbi Emmanuel Rose. And the mourner's Kaddish is right here. Those who are saying Kaddish should rise, and everybody else, I need you to unmute yourselves so we can hear your amens. I need a minion of you to unmute. I think we got a minion of unmuted people. Okay, good. Alrighty, and the mourner's Kaddish is right here. Yitkadal, Yitkadash, Rabbi.
Amen.
Amen. Maya.
Rach, Yishtabach, Yitbar, Ela min kol birkatav shirata, miram alma v'ru amen.
Amen.
Shalom
Amen.
Ramav.
Amen.
Thank you to all of you for being here, and again, thank you to the Chazan for his leading, and also for leading in my absence during the week. Tomorrow morning is 8 a.m. As it usually is, but the service is longer because it has Haftarah as well as chanting of parts of Eichah. But it's a powerful and important service, so I hope to see you tomorrow morning at 8. Take care. Laila Tov.
Asher Koach.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye. Welcome back.